take for granted that many swords throughout history have forms of hand protection, whether they're from Europe, from Asia, Africa, or elsewhere in the world. So the really big question here is, if swords so often had hand protection on them, but spears were much more common weapons throughout history and across the world, why didn't spears have hand protection like swords did? And why did some spears actually have hand protection? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now, many of you, hopefully most of you watching this channel will know by now that spears globally and throughout time periods have been actually, you could say, far more important weapons, but certainly much more prevalent and much more numerous weapons than swords have been. Now, obviously we all love swords and swords get lots of attention and we spend a lot of time on this channel talking about swords. And in doing so, we often talk about the nature of hand protection on swords. Why do some have long handguards? Why do some have short handguards? Why do some have other forms of handguards, such as discs or super? Why do some develop complex handguards later on? These are all really good questions that I've addressed in many videos in the past. But one elephant in the room is that I often point out that swords are backup weapons to spears. So if people spent more of history, and even individuals spent more of their own time with a spear in their hand, why weren't they more concerned with hand protection with spears? Well, before I jump into the real meat and context here of why you don't really want a handguard on most spears, and there are some really good reasons, we're going to look at those, and then we're going to look at some exceptions to that rule. I first want to point out the general context of spears in combat. These are, of course, primarily, and there are some perhaps exceptions to this, but they're primarily thrusting weapons, and in certain parts of the world also throwing weapons, depending on the type of the spear. Now, something that you are thrusting, especially if you're against other people with spears, yes, you can get hit in the hand, but it's generally speaking slightly less of a risk to your hand than with cutting weapons. Weapons that are traversing space with the edges and moving around like this in front of the combatants are overall less likely to, or rather more likely to, injure and incapacitate the hand than thrusting weapons are, either held overhand or underhand, because this is a relatively small target for a point. However, edges traverse a lot of space. So edged weapons are more likely overall to wound the hands, or rather cutting weapons are more likely to wound the hands, I would argue, than this type of thrusting weapon. That being said, when we look at thrusting swords like small swords and rapiers, well, they certainly consider the guards as important. So there are other, of course, wider contextual factors here, and we're going to look at some of those here as specific points. But one of those also is the fact that you have to remember that with a spear, you have an incredibly long gripping handle, and all parts of this handle might be used at different points. Sometimes you might choke up and be using it here. Sometimes you might be holding it fully at the back. Sometimes, of course, you want to throw it. Sometimes you might hold it further back to give a bit more reach, which obviously affects the balance, and things like this. So the fact that this is an entirely gripping area for either using with one hand or two hands really changes the context fundamentally from a sword, where the gripping area is really only a very small region at one end of the weapon. So to be even more clear, and we're going to address this point in a second, the fundamental question, if you were to put some form of handguard on a spear, is where do you put it? Because this entire region of the weapon is a grip or a handle. That being said, they did put handguards on spears, but we'll get to that towards the end of the video. So the very first, and I think the most important reason why you don't want to put a form of handguard onto a spear is fundamentally because it's going to be an impediment to its use as a spear. What do I mean by that? Well, fundamentally, the primary purpose of the spear is to slip between gaps in the opponent's defense, either an individual or a group, like a shield wall, for example, that you're fighting against. Get between those shields or between the person's weapons or arms or limbs or whatever, and to stab them, fundamentally. And anything that projects laterally from this weapon could be a big impediment to that. Now, as we're going to see later in the video, there are weapons which have lateral projections, and we have to accept from the outset that this can be an advantage, we'll talk about those, but it can also be a disadvantage because fundamentally this is a narrow object that wants to get into narrow holes, and anything sticking out sideways potentially will prevent that from happening. And speaking historically and ethnographically around the world, the most important thing to try and get past with a spear is a shield. If a shield is in the way, this is the main thing blocking you from getting your stab in. So fundamentally, anything that projects sideways, in other words, that might protect your hand, out of this spear, is potentially not only going to clash with the opponent's shield and therefore fail to hit them, but it might clash with your own shield as well. So you want to be keeping your weapon quite close to your shield for defensive purposes, but also quite close to the opponent's shield so that you can come around the edge of it. And as I say, anything sticking out or projecting from this narrow shaft is actually, in a very real terms, and we have experimented with this, and this is very much the case, is going to very often collide with your own shield, their shield, and therefore make this a less potent weapon. But indeed, there are other disadvantages to having projections sticking out of your weapon somewhere sideways along here. Aside from shields, that is, it could get caught simply in clothes or armour or other equipment, which might be an impediment. And that could be yours, it could be the opponent's, it could be someone who you weren't even trying to hit, it could be the person standing next to them. So anything that gets caught up. Now, extrapolating from that, one of the counters against spears, if they're being aimed at you, is actually obviously to parry them, but also to grab them. Now, funnily enough, with both of those situations, things which project out sideways or it's kind of project in any way out of the side of the socket or the shaft, number one, they make it easier to, with certain exceptions, which we'll get to later, it can make it easier to grab or oppose, in other words, to just block. So say, for example, I've just got a sword and a person's stabbing a spear at me. If I try and parry this spear, there is a good chance that it will slide past anyway. But if it has projections sticking out the side, I've now got something to bind against with my blade, with my weapon. Could be an axe, a mace, doesn't have to be a sword, or indeed just simply with my hand, or even just grabbing it. So if I grab the shaft here, it's going to be easier for a person to still manipulate their weapon out of my hand if it doesn't have projecting side lugs. Again, there's an exception I'll give later. Okay, so if it has projecting side lugs, guards, something like that, that's going to make it easier for me to grab this weapon and parry it. Another minor disadvantage, and I'm not even sure that I'm convinced of this one myself actually, is if there are projections from the side, it could potentially make the spear harder to throw. Now, that, number one, not all spears are intended to be thrown, so that's not a disadvantage for them, obviously. And also, I would say that I have thrown spears which have side projections and they still go, they still fly through the air. But I would say overall, it's probably not optimal for the throwing spear. But we're going to finish off with the final, I think, major disadvantage to having handguards or side projections from spears. And that is quite fundamentally resources on a broad sense. So that could be expense, because it's going to cost more, it's going to take more time to make, and also important, because you have more resource attached to your weapon, it will make it heavier fundamentally, unless you drastically change the design of the head to make the head very small, for example, to compensate for the added weight of the guard. Overall, if you just take your typical spear and you add some form of handguard to it, not only is it going to make the overall weight of the weapon heavier, which is not necessarily a problem, but perhaps more of a problem, it's going to affect the balance of the weapon, which does mean that if you're using a spear one-handed, then if you add more weight here, it's more difficult to manage. That means you have to hold it further forward at the balance point, so it changes the balance point and therefore gives you less reach. And overall, reach is one of the main advantages of a spear, so why reduce the amount of reach of a spear if you're using it one-handed? We'll talk about that in a minute. So overall, you want a spear to be balanced enough, and you'll notice this example, this Sudanese example, actually has a counterbalance at the back, so you can easily hold the spear as far back as possible so that for a given length, and this isn't a very long spear, it only comes up to my chest, but it has the same reach as a much longer spear because of the way it's balanced. So anything weight-wise that you add up near the front is going to mitigate your reach. So hopefully I've covered the main reasons why you don't want to put cross guards or other forms of handguard onto most one-handed spears. But you will hopefully know that there are spears which have lateral projections on them, and there's been one lurking behind me. Did you spot it before this point? Let me know. Did you see the spoiler in the background there? So, winged spears. Now, you've seen this one plenty of times before. This is a type of spear that was used in the early medieval period. So we're looking at 9th, 10th, 11th centuries in Europe. This is obviously a replica of what we would commonly call a winged spear. Now, this is a fairly large weapon, and it's very difficult to your typical, very different to your typical one-handed spear. This is actually quite a large head, but most one-handed spears have smaller heads than that. And this is a different type of weapon because this is, although you could use it in one hand, just about, with a spear, with a shield, overall, this is probably something that wants to be used in two hands. We're going to come back to this one hand versus two-handed thing throughout this section. So this is a winged spear, and of course within Europe there are other related weapons to this. In fact, the winged spear, later called in Italian the ghiavarina, which develops into the spontoon, is around all the way through from the early medieval period right the way through the Renaissance, and in fact into the industrial age, gunpowder lines of soldiers at Waterloo. The sergeants were still carrying spontoons then. So relatives of this weapon were around right the way through. And of course in the medieval period and Renaissance we have things like the partisan and other forms of winged or cross-guarded spears. In fact, we also see in certain sources you actually see additional cross-guards added on. And you'll notice most of these are up towards the head end. We'll come back to that point in a second. If we go over to Asia, for example, we will find very famous examples in Japan. There's the Jumonji Yari, which you could say is a bit halfway between a sort of partisan and a trident, where you've got essentially extra blades up here. Now, I did point out earlier in this video that there was an exception to grabbing crossguards or grabbing side projections, and there is a good example, the same thing as the partisan in Europe. So with partisans and things like the Ransur and Corsac and things like this, and also with the Jumonji Yari, the side projections, while they perform the advantages of parrying and other things, we'll get to that in a second, they are edged and pointed, so you wouldn't really want to grab them. But nevertheless, if you were using a weapon against them, that would be absolutely fine, and you could oppose those and parry those a little bit more easily because of the side projections, although that goes both ways. We'll come back to that. In Japan, we also have something called the Kagi Yari. Now, the Kagi Yari is, unlike with the Jumonji Yari, where we've got essentially blades added onto the head here, as we would do with a partisan or a Corsac. Instead, with the Kagi Yari, we actually have a separate crossguard added onto the shaft. And this is actually something we also find occasionally in China and in Europe. So very briefly, what is the advantage of having side projections like this on a form of spear, usually two-handed spear, whether it's the Jumonji Yari, whether it's a winged spear or partisan or Corsac or a trident even. So first of all, the most obvious advantage is defensively. Rather than the two shafts which of spears can easily slide against each other and slide up and down, as soon as you have a lateral projection, you have a point of leverage whereby you can control the opponent's weapon or block the opponent's weapon. So if someone's thrusting at me, I can of course defend more easily because I've got these side lugs, but equally I can push their weapon downwards or upwards or off to the side. I can manipulate it. And of course, those side lugs don't only have to be, or can't only be used against the opponent's weapon. They could be used against the opponent's body, their arms, their hands. You can jam that into someone's knuckles or push against their forearm, or indeed you could push against their face or helmet. You could hook them around the back of the knee. You could hook them around the shield. You could try and strip the weapon out of their hand by pulling it out. So these can push, they can pull, they can block, they can even, at a pinch, actually hit laterally as well. They're more effective at now hitting sideways with the weapon than it would be if it was just a stick. So they have a whole bunch of uses, and they're definitely very, very useful, even though they potentially also have the disadvantages that we looked at earlier. And it's perhaps worth noting that whether we're looking at feudal Japan with the Jumonji Yari, whether we're looking at similar weapons in China, or whether we're looking at medieval and Renaissance Europe, it does seem that usually spears like this with lateral projections, while they were used by some people, they weren't usually the main weapon. The main weapon was usually either a pike or a spear or a lance, a weapon which was more typical like this. So these usually outnumbered these. So while these have advantages and disadvantages, it does seem that overall they're probably not the best weapon to give all of your infantry. The standard spear, yari, got a yari behind me here, the standard straight one without any form of projections or guard on it, for the most part, for most people, are going to be the most typical and useful type of spear to give them. However, what you might find is that if you have 10 people with typical spears, it might be useful to mix in 1 in 10 of these unusual side-lugged hooking, trapping and pushing spears with forms of wing or lug on them mixed in amongst your normal spears, because then what they can do is they can work together, and the guys with these can try and push gaps into the opposing spear block or pike block, so that the people with the typical spikes or spears can stab into them. So very often we find that these two weapons, it's not an either or, which one are we going to give our troops. It's actually, well, we'll give most of them the typical, most useful type of spear, but we'll give some of them these because they will make these guys even more effective. So to conclude, I think I've given most of the reasons why most typical spears don't either need or don't want to have hand protection or lugs or side projections on them, because overall, en masse, there will probably be more disadvantage than advantage for the primary purpose of these, which is really to stab into small gaps and get through and get between things, where side projections would be more of a liability than a benefit. That being said, side projections can have an enormous number of uses, and they were used. They were used in medieval and Renaissance Europe all the way through, in fact, to the 19th century. And indeed, they were used in Japan and China and Korea and lots of other places as well, some of the time, but they were never, as far as I can think, they were never the normal or typical type or form of spear. They were always the exception or a special type, probably for the most part, to be used in conjunction with troops with these. We also must mention that overall these sorts of side lugs are most useful with a two-handed spear. Okay, so where we're looking at periods of history or geography where spears are usually being used with a shield, when the spear is being used with a shield, we don't generally find side projections on them. When we do find partisans, winged spears, Jumonji Yari, these types of weapons with side projections, it's almost always where the soldier using them is using the weapon two-handed, and that is where you have the greatest push and pull and leverage available to you in order to make the maximum use of those lugs or projections. And finally, just to note that there isn't only one option or the other. It's not only a cross projection, cross guard or lugs, or none at all. There is another option. I'll just put this spear away for a second and grab my poleaxe. So there are also disc guards. And of course, this is interesting because we see a parallel with Chinese, Japanese and Korean swords, which have disc guards on them as well. And various weapons throughout history have had disc guards on them, everything from the Alchbeast to the poleaxe. And we do in fact find it sometimes on glaives and on spears and pikes as well. Usually they are relatively high up. That's about as low as they ever get. Usually they are mounted higher up towards the head, and that is coming back to my earlier point, so that you still have the full maximum use of the hilt, if you like it, the handle portion, the grip portion of the weapon. Because the problem with putting any guard lower down is it of course limits how much of the shaft you can use. And with any type of spear, and as you'll see these lugs are high up, you want to be able to use both ends of the spear liberally, because one of the disadvantages of a polearm is someone rushing in close and getting past your point. So you need to be able to slide it back and turn the weapon around and use either end easily. So you need the maximum length of your shaft here, which of course is another major reason why you don't want a guard lower down nearer your hands. Anyway, I hope that's been thought-provoking. Do you think I missed any major points here? Do you disagree? Can you think of other examples of spears or similar weapons with side projections or handguards of them of some sort. And finally, the very last parting thought, there are other ways to protect the hand, of course. And later on, when certain types of armour come in and you can wear gauntlets and stuff like that, but clearly at that point the armour is protecting your hand. But equally, with the Japanese weapons, with the Yari specifically, we see another option that we'll maybe look at in greater depth in a future video. And that is things like these rings and the rattan and lacquered binding on the shaft here that mean that if an opponent's sword specifically, or could be any other weapon actually, hits into the shaft, it is more likely to bind up here and less likely to slide down towards your hand anyway. So there are other ways that you can achieve greater hand protection than simply by sticking, like with the Kagiyari, a great big crossguard on it, even though the Japanese did that as well some of the time. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will continue to be, hopefully, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.